Hello, welcome to the ninth Wednesday talk of MURCIR in 2024. Today we have a special guest speaker, Professor Senem Aydın Düzgit from Sabancı University and also from Istanbul Policy Center. We are planning to discuss the changing international order and its impact on the middle powers. But before we begin our session, allow me to provide a brief introduction about our research center. MURCIR, or in the long form, we can say that the Marmara University Research Center for International Relations has been a pillar of academic excellence for the past 30 years, especially in Istanbul, thanks to the valuable contributions of the numerous prominent scholars in Turkish academia. It has not only witnessed, but also actively contributed to the evolution of international relations since the end of the Cold War. So please follow our activities through social media accounts and YouTube channel. Your subscriptions and likes will promote our studies more. So before leaving the floor to our guest speaker, let me to introduce her very long and detailed CV. So the Senem Aydın Düzgit is a professor of international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Sabancı University and a senior scholar and research and academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center. And her main research interests are the European foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, EU-Turkey relations, discourse studies, and identity in international relations. And when we look at her educational background, we can see a PhD from Brussels, Vrije University, Brussels, and an MSc from London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA from Boğaziçi University. She has a very long list of publications, actually, from very prominent journals, academic journals. And today she is planning to present very important researches about this changing international order. Welcome again to MURCIR online meetings. So we are listening to you. Thanks again for your valuable contribution.
Thank you very much, Zuhal Hocam. I'm very happy and I feel very privileged to have been invited to this speaker series. And it's very nice to see friends and friendly faces as well. So thank you for the invitation. So today I'm going to talk about a relatively more recent research project of mine. I say recent, but of course it still goes back a few years. As you know, in academia, that's recent. And I feel the need to say that because in the earlier years of my academic work, as some of you might know, I have focused mostly on EU foreign policy, EU's enlargement policy, Turkish foreign policy, Turkey's relationship with the EU, etc., etc. So it was very much, I looked at the issue of identity, international politics, but within the empirical or through the empirical case of European foreign policy mostly. Now, of course, as I had embarked on that work, I had noticed something, that this notion of the West was becoming more and more contested in Turkey, but I was also noticing that this was also the case in many new enlargement countries like the Western Balkans, etc. So that brought me to sort of thinking about the sources of resentment with the West and anti-Westernism. And as I dig deep into that, I have actually seen that much of it had to do with the so-called legitimacy crisis of the global order. Now, let me just say a few things about that, or how I think about that, or how I conceptualize that. And of course, that will bring us to the discussion of middle powers. Basically, we know that today we are living in a global context which is going or moving towards multipolarity. I don't think we can confidently say that we are living in a multipolar world already. and that the American power and hegemony has declined for once and for all. But definitely an era has been ending and something new will begin, and we're at this interregnum period, right? As you know, as Gramsci would have put it mainly, but I couldn't put it better. So this is the global context within which we're operating. Now, within this context, of course, when we look at the West, well, if you take the European Union, for instance, this is an institution that has been going through a polycrisis period for the past decade or so. It had the Euro crisis, it had the migration crisis, then COVID hit it pretty badly. And then, of course, most recently, you had the Russia-Ukraine war on its doorstep. On the other hand, of course, we know that the American hegemony had been relatively declining as America started to retreat from various different conflict theaters in the world as well. And of course, we have the phenomena of a rising China. And we had big questions about whether that rise would be peaceful, whether it would be conflictual, or what it would imply for global politics. And of course, at the same time, we had the rise of the so-called BRICS countries like Brazil and India. And finally, of course, we have seen a much more assertive Russian foreign policy in its sort of conventional post-Soviet operating space. A much more aggressive foreign policy, a much more interventionist foreign policy, which ultimately culminated in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So basically, we're operating, or the world is in a context, countries are operating in a context where multipolarity is rising and where the future of the so-called liberal international order, whether we can ever call it liberal or international, is of course something that we can debate later if you want, because obviously that's also open for discussion, is being more and more questioned, whether we've approached the end of it, if it has ever existed, right? So, I mean, in this changing global context, much attention has been paid to, first of all, contesters of the so-called global order within the West. That means, of course, that refers to populist parties, mostly far-right populist parties across Europe, but also, the Trump phenomena and the state that the Republican Party is in the United States today. So a lot has been said about, the problem that these parties have with liberalism, the problem that they have with globalization, and what these parties represent, and what the root sources of their support comes from. And there's also been quite a lot of work on the usual so-called suspects, or the contesters, or the sort of the anti-Western world, and that is, of course, Russia and China. A lot has been written about China, for instance, and it's been argued that, the regime security is at the center of how it approaches its international politics. A lot of attention has already been drawn to Russia, that is even before its invasion of Ukraine. For instance, I've written on the Russian contestation of Europe in particular, and have argued that this is also a normative contestation in its own right. So we can't argue that it's only the West that refers to norm-based arguments and that Russia does it very much as well, but it subverts the normative arguments that the West uses. But there had relatively been less emphasis on the so-called middle powers and how they approach the liberal order. And if they are contesting this order, why are they contesting it? And also how they are contesting it. Now, of course, that takes us first to a definition of what middle powers are. So first of all, there is a definitional issue or a problem here that we need to resolve. Now, these countries, of course, conventionally speaking or defining them, they can neither be defined as big powers or small powers, that they are somewhere in between when it comes to power, capacity, and effectiveness, and in terms of their power projection and reach out beyond their borders. But these are also countries that have the potential to hinder, obstruct, or to facilitate global governance and the global order as well. And most of the literature until recently have defined these powers as contributors to the international order. Contributors in the sense that they would contribute to the systemic stability of this order. Countries, of course, that were referred to as contributors in this conventional literature on middle powers were those like Australia, Canada, Sweden, etc., that took part in multilateral cooperation efforts that try to strengthen or contribute to the strengthening of global institutions, international institutions, etc. Now, of course, with the end of the Cold War and with this rise of multipolarity that I just referred to at the beginning, the category of these middle powers, these countries, which the concept refers to, has also expanded. Now when we talk about middle powers, we also talk about Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey. All of these are now defined more or less or conceptualized more or less in the middle powerhood framework. Now, early on, it was sort of more or less, there was a more or less consensus that these countries too were in a more of a system supporting role in the international system. That they wanted some reform of international governance, global governance, like for instance, we know the famous "the world is bigger than five" argument that was propagated by Turkey with reference to the reform of the UN Security Council. But apart from these reform pleas, that they were more or less fine with the working of the system, and they were taking part in mediation efforts, taking active roles in international institutions, so in some ways contributing to global governance where they see fit. Having said that, in the last few years, it has become more common for us to observe that these powers, that these middle powers, started to contest these institutions and contest the so-called order rather than solely contribute to it. And the argument there was that there was now an emerging division between these old conventional, mostly Western middle powers and the so-called emerging middle powers, such as Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, etc., whatever, in the way in which they approach this international order. So basically, these emerging powers were emerging to be more of contesters rather than contributors. Now, hence comes the interesting question of whether or not they are contesting, and if so, why they are contesting, and of course, how they are contesting. Now, my research, and I recently published an article in International Affairs on these grounds, so if anybody is interested, I can also share it with you. But also, I'm also working on, for other country cases, so I'm working within the same or similar, I would say, research strand for the next couple of years, is to look at how and why these contesters are doing what they're doing. Now, my argument is that, yes, they are contesting. They are contesting both through their discourses, and they're also contesting through their foreign policy practices. Now, when we look at discourses, what we see is a plea for global justice. So that is the discursive frame, I would say, a sort of the broader, larger umbrella frame that captures more or less the discursive contestation by most of these powers in the international order. What kind of global justice claims are we looking at? For instance, climate justice. Ibrahim Hoca is here, of course. He would know that better than I do. But so that's one of the justice claims that comes from these powers. Basically, the argument is, well, look, you're asking us to comply with certain climate regulations, right? For instance, when we're trading with the European Union, or you're asking us to take down and reduce our emissions, but then, you are no trouble because you've already done that. You've completed what you need to do. You've completed your industrialization. Now it's time for us to grow. And so this is not just, right? So if you expect us to do this, then you have to help us in one way or another, financially, this or that. Other types of justice claims for more equitable socioeconomic distribution, right, globally speaking. Another justice claim more fairer distribution in institutions of global governance, such as the United Nations. I mean, I just referred to the Turkish example, for instance, earlier, that, you know, the argument here is that the Security Council can no longer function and you need to reform it. But then, of course, those who have a veto power would also have a say in how it's going to be reformed. So there's a deadlock there. But anyhow, that does not mean that the plea for justice in those and other type of institutions are not there. And of course, there is an historical justice claim as well, especially regarding colonialism, right? The argument that, you know, colonial justice or justice in terms of the repercussions of the colonial past has not been realized yet, right? There have been claims for repatriations, etc., for instance, from Germany, that has never even been discussed substantially, so nothing has been done about it, and many others. So basically, there are various different ways in which you have these global justice claims that add up basic discursive contestation based on the plea to live in a more just world socioeconomically, institutionally, historically, epistemologically, etc. So what have you. And this is kind of normal, right? Because if we, I mean, you know, starting off our debate on the liberal international order, if you talk about the liberal order, liberalism itself basically entails a promise to justice, right? Yes, but that also conflicts with the requirement of an order which relies on the establishment of a hierarchy. So there is a conflict, in other words, between you know, liberalism and order making within the way in which they refer to justice and justice claims. Just to give you an example of how this discursive contestation takes place, for instance, with the case of Turkey, where I did a systematic analysis in the latest article that I've just mentioned, you see that at the global scene, Turkey mainly contests the West, and in particular Europe, through the way in which it has treated refugees, through the way in which it has not faced up to its colonial past, through the double standards rhetoric, especially in its claims to democracy from third countries, but also not complying with democracy necessarily inside its borders, but also when it suits its interests with other third states that are authoritarian, like Egypt, etc., that are under military regimes. So, and this double standard, this is not very unique to Turkey. I mean, this double standard rhetoric is a very typical rhetoric of these middle powers. The hypocrisy charge is a charge that is not just expressed by Turkey, but many of these powers, and it holds on various levels, and it connects with the notion of global justice that I have just described. So when you look at this discursive contestation, what you see is a certain understanding of global justice informs the discursive contestation by these powers. And I conceptualize these as global justice defined as impartiality and global justice defined as mutual recognition. Basically, what I mean by that is that an understanding of global justice that does not just rely on a very thin understanding of state sovereignty, where states are just free to do what they please, but where states feel responsible for whatever is happening to the citizens of other states, whatever is happening to the refugees, etc. In other words, the subjects here are much broader. An understanding of justice here is much thicker than, say, an understanding of global justice as non-domination. Because if you took global justice non-domination, that's a very thin understanding and a very sort of conventional, typical understanding of global justice, and a realist one, if I may say, in the international system, where, you know, state sovereignty and sovereign states' interests are really key, and beyond that, there is no recourse to justice. Now, this was the discursive element. But when you actually look at the practices, that is the foreign practices of these actors, you see that there is a discrepancy between the global justice claims behind that underlie the discourse and the global justice claims or concepts that are inherent in the actual contestation practices. In other words, if I have to put it in more simpler terms, when you look at the practices of contestation, we see that the practices are very much informed by this notion of global justice as non-domination. That is, a sovereign state interest is the key, and these states are not often happy with when they're told by outsiders about how they treat this or that. They are very sensitive when it comes to international criticism of domestic regimes or rule of law, human rights, and these kind of things. And often they are the ones that engage in migration agreements with Western partner countries as well, right? So you have a situation, in other words, where you have a discourse that is very much strongly embedded in a much thicker understanding of global justice, and a practice that where contestation is mainly driven by the pursuit of sovereign state interests. And whenever that state interest contrasts with that of the West, then of course you have an act of contestation. And this we see much more of it. Why? Because we are going through a much more multipolar order. And also within this order, there is a very famous term these days that are used by many of these countries, the concept of strategic autonomy, where these countries try to carve out an autonomous space of action, a sphere of action for themselves. And that is the context in which they operate. Now, what does this discrepancy, this conceptual discrepancy between the discourse and the practice mean for us, in terms of the drivers of contestation? Well, this discrepancy actually shows us, if we dig deep into the analysis, the empirical analysis that is, we see that the contestation occurs precisely at the point in which these countries seek autonomy for the purposes of attaining their regime security. However, that regime security might be defined in different national contexts. For instance, in Turkey, it's nationalism, legitimacy, state capitalism, etc. In other countries, you have similar legitimating claims of regimes, but in some different. It doesn't matter. Basically, the idea here is that to understand the drivers of contestation, we have to look at what is happening inside these middle powers. So it's impossible to explain it from a purely IR point of view unless you open up the black box and bring in insights from comparative politics also to understand where and how contestation takes place. And this becomes more and more important as these countries, some of these countries turn or backslide in their democracies as well. Because when that happens, then the issue of regime security becomes more important. But it doesn't always have to be the case, right? If you take the case of India, for instance, you have a country that is contesting in some areas and not contesting in others, but also turning very authoritarian domestically with the Modi government. And they also have a dictum of strategic autonomy, right? So when you hear the word strategic autonomy, there are two things that we should be asking ourselves to understand who the autonomy is serving, right? And whether it's going to actually work. First question would be autonomy from whom? And the second question would be autonomy for what? Now, autonomy for whom depends, of course, on the country that you're looking at. For most of these countries, autonomy for the US is important, like for the Turkish case as well. But for others, for instance, in addition to US, you might have other regional powers that they want autonomy from, like China, for instance, in the case of Indonesia, okay? So you have to look at the regional dynamics in which global powers are dominant in which areas to understand who autonomy is defined against or in relation to. The second question, of course, is the question of strategic autonomy for what purpose? Now, this is important because what we're seeing is that the more populist regimes are, especially in terms of their leadership and foreign policy, the more autonomy is defined in terms of serving short-term populist interests domestically. and not necessarily serving the national interest that can be defined in the long run, right? So that is something, of course, that really reduces the strategic part, the weight of the strategic part of the autonomy debate, and makes us wonder or question whether that strategic autonomy seeking is really sustainable or whether it has any chances of success. So I think I'm going to stop it here, Zuhal Hocam, because I think I've already almost reached my time limit. So if you have any questions or any comments, I'd be very happy to receive them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It is really wide issue. So from where to start and how to analyze was really frightening me when I was thinking about the topic, and you managed to make it so properly, I think. But maybe we have some additional questions. So I see two questions. The first hand was Sezgi Durgun from our department, from Marmara University, Political Science and International Relations Department. Sezgi Hocam, you can ask your question by opening up your microphone. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed your talk and your comments. And I'm really interested in the issue, the refugee issue that you have mentioned about the as a challenging issue as far as it's concerned, as a litmus paper of this double standards applied in the European context. But do you think Turkey is also kind of imitating Europe's policies in its own ways? Or what could be the right position? What do you think?
Well, thank you very much, Sezgi Hocam, for this very important question. Well, when you look at the Turkish case, what you see is, I mean, of course, you're absolutely right that Turkey is complicit in the EU migration policy, which it criticizes in discourse and globally, right? Because obviously Turkey is the country that signed the EU-Turkey statement. It's the first of its kind. Now the EU tries to repeat it with other third states like Tunisia, etc. So it's become a model in itself. But on the other hand, you see that Turkey is very much critical of Europe on how it treats migrants and refugees, etc., on international platforms. I think this shows, that brings me to the first point about this inconsistency or the conceptual gap between discourse and practice. And this is happening because discourse is used as a very pragmatic instrument to discredit Europe or to undermine its legitimacy at the global scene, in theaters, in places, in geographic regions where Turkey is competing with Europe and the West, such as in Africa, for instance, where this discourse holds, right? And where Turkey also is expanding its presence economically, etc., whatever. So I see it as more of a discourse-wise strategic tool, because otherwise you're absolutely right. These countries are all complicit in this migration regime that is beginning to develop in the wider European, much wider European neighborhood.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. İbrahim Hocam, buyurun.
Thank you very much, Senem Hocam. Hello again. Thank you
It's very nice to see you, Ibrahim Hocam.
We will see each other just in a couple of days, I guess.
Yes.
So thank you very much for this analytical, speech seminar. When I was listening, to your presentation, I was thinking about this multiplex world order, which, as you know, Ahari and his colleagues have been introducing, and just as you know, they have been summarizing that multiplex world order in 4 dimensions, right? The first one, as you have been mentioning, about the absence or the weakening of the global hegemony, either by one state or by a group of states. I mean, not necessarily only the United States, but as you mentioned, Europe, for example. But instead, replacing with the, more equal, more just, presence of the other states, the presence of the global civil society, and so on and so forth. I mean, we know that arguments altogether. And the second dimension is interdependence, which has been, unlike neoliberal globalization, that interdependence is not about economy, but also, as you know, the environment, sustainable development, peace, prosperity, justice, and so on and so forth. Again, we are mentioning the similar, as you know, arguments that sometimes Turkey has been, getting into. And the third was, as you know, some sort of, let's say, multi-level global governance structure. As you have been very much, rightly saying, for example, the world is bigger than five. So not only the inclusion of the challenges of the middle powers, but also, as you know, setting up of the regional governance systems in each, specific, let's say, regions and territories and geographies, and also the setting up of some sort of hybrid systems, right? I mean, talking with the global governance and the regional governance systems. And the last one is the ideological, cultural, political diversity, which again, Turkey is getting a huge, let's say, actor furthering that argument, and it is coming from that if there would be that kind of diversity, again, the security, the stability in the global order will be better. Now, just when I was thinking about that, I mean, you've been very much rightly mentioning about some issues like this global governance with the UN, the justice, especially the justice of the oppressed people. I mean, when we just think in terms of the, for example, Turkey's support for Hamas and their discourses. So what I would wonder is that can we just say that Turkey is advocating for every component of this, so-called justice movement and the multiplex order, or is it something sometimes behaving very much selective? I mean, by sometimes putting their interests first and providing a discourse related with that. I mean, otherwise it would not be having, for example, such kind of discourse. Or is it really a normative power, I mean, which we use for the European Union countries, you know better than me, but it is a normative power in the region, for example, who would be really ethically and in the principle terms had been advocating whatever the interests of the of Turkey would be. I mean, that is my wonder, and I would like very much to hear your arguments, your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim Hocam, for this excellent question. Okay, well, regarding your first question, whether Turkey is a normative power, I don't think so, but then again, none of them are. So, because if we define normative power as a genuine drive to define what normal is in world politics, because by definition, that's what a normative power is, and to basically try to expand those norms deliberately via soft power tools, that's not what it's doing. What it's doing instead is very much interest-based. And this is, again, as I said, not unique to Turkey. This is what most of these, how all of these middle powers are working towards. But this interest ensures that their participation or contestation then becomes very selective, Ibrahim Hocam. So you're right. And it's this selectivity that begs an explanation. So in other words, what we as scholars should do or try to do is, where does this interest lie, right? So it's interest-based, obviously, because the discourse and the practice doesn't match at all. But then the question is, whose interest are we talking about? or how do you define the national interest? And that, of course, the way you approach this question depends very much on the theoretical angle that you take on it, right? So if you're more of a critical scholar like me, closer to critical theories, then you approach this notion of national interest as a very much constructed matter and try to see how the nation is defined and with reference to what, which then takes you to which can take you to a different place in terms of finding the answer to where that interest lies, right? But if you take national interest as a given and a country as a black box, then of course you might end up with a different kind of explanation. My explanation would be, being a critical scholar, is that in these countries, the national interest is defined differently, very much depending on domestic politics of these countries, most of them, and what their regimes or what the constitutive pillars of their regime security are. For instance, I mean, I mentioned that in the Turkish case, it was mostly, nationalism, legitimacy, finding money, finances for state capitalism, etc. Right? In the Indian case, it's, for instance, nationalism is also a very important part of it. That's why no way they would, make any compromises or be very assertive in their international alignments as far as the Kashmir issue is concerned, right? But then they can move back and forth with the United States, etc., depending on other issue areas. So that's where we need to look at. But then again, that gives you the answer that when we look at contestation, or when we look at cooperation, or when we look at which parts of this multiplex order that they will contribute to and contest, it's mostly the regime dynamics that we have to be looking at. I hope that goes towards, some way towards answering your question, but
it was very interesting and very good
Thank
answer.
you very much.
Yes, please. Do you want to have something to add, Ibrahim Hocam? No?
Yes, can I follow
Yes,
up one
please.
point,
Yes,
Senem Hocam?
yes.
I mean, yes, basically, I am also thinking like you. I mean, can we say that, for example, in terms of the United Nations structure, I mean, the world is bigger than 5, and also some other middle powers or the emerging powers are, as you know, putting the same issue, similar issue with some different discourses as well. But as a result, we are just coming to a point that there are some pressures on the especially UN Security Council, which new actors are trying to enter, right? I mean, except Turkey, for example, we know Brazil, for example, is becoming a part of that. India is becoming a part of the UN Security Council, perhaps South Africa, for example, again, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, what I wonder is that while they have been putting that kind of normative discourse, for example, and as you said, the construct what is normative and what is good, would that, I mean, it's a counterfactual, obviously, we cannot know for sure, but would it be leading us to the similar problems that we are living right now in the UN Security Council, even when those countries, including the European countries like Germany, for example, we know it is very much pushing forward that. So would it be I mean, the addition of these new, for example, emerging powers would change the rationality, normativity of the United Nations Council, for example, or would it be only a new addition and creating the group more with the entrance of the new countries? I mean, what would be the actual, I mean, way for that?
I suppose we have an interruption. Can you hear right now?
I think very much depend on institutional design of what it would look like. But I think, I mean, design seems to be very difficult to attain. In my opinion, that's a deadlock. But still, I mean, I'd just like to underline, because you mentioned it, and rightly so, that the way that these powers like South Africa are trying to make a normative intervention through the UN also matters, even though it cannot make a difference in terms of the decision-making structure. It makes an intervention legally and by the use of force. And in that sense, you were talking about normative power. That is very much normative, because it does not see to its interest in any way, shape, and form, although it draws some parallels with its own apartheid history, of course. So there's a historical dimension there. But that's a normative intervention, and that has a certain weight in the world in terms of swinging public opinion as well when it comes to matters like Israel and Palestine. So we shouldn't underestimate, I think, the role that they have. But whether things would change if they were in the system depends very much on what that system would look like, who would have the veto powers in that system. Because if you look at the EU, for instance, they also suffer from the same problem, right? They have to decide by unanimity when it comes to common foreign and security policy, which means that they cannot decide on anything. They're stuck. They are blackmailed by Orban whenever he feels like it. They can't even vote financial package to Ukraine. There is no way that they can do anything on Israel and Palestine, and they basically can't keep up with the world where geopolitical conflicts are on the rise, because what this multipolarity is also doing is that we're seeing more and more flaring up of regional conflicts in those places where America is withdrawing and other powers like Turkey, Russia, China, etc., are reasserting themselves. And in that context, of course, when you have the decision-making stuck, like in the European Union, then you don't have a force for good, bad, for anything. And I think it's the same situation with the United Nations. And that means that with the rise of multipolarity, what we most likely will see is more assertiveness on the part of these nation states, middle or big, and more, spaces that these countries will try to carve for themselves in their regions where they have left, and make these normative interventions if and where it suits their interests or not, or because of other reasons like South Africa, at the global sphere, and whether or not that will result or amount to anything, maybe not in the short run, but in the long run, I do believe that they have a significant value.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution, Ibrahim Hocam. Your analysis are also very valuable to discuss these details. And maybe we have another question, maybe a last question we may take. Do we have another question from our participants? No, I see. Maybe I may have a question. So most of us, we are so aware that what's happening now in Gaza. So everybody is questioning about the liberal order and the normative order. So it is considered like this, the hypocrisy and other things. So what do you think about this? I'm actually a believer about this normative orders. So I think that somehow, okay, we can see some unjust situations, some problems as it happened every time in history. So what do you think about this? Do you think that all these things happening around us are proof or argue that now we don't have anymore this normative world order?
Well, Zuhal Hocam, I don't want to disappoint you, but I have to say that the way in which the Western community at large, of course, it's not a homogenous community. You have countries, individual countries like Spain, Belgium, etc., that have very harshly to the Israeli actions towards Gaza. But overall, when you look at the United States and when you look at countries like Germany and main countries in the European Union, basically it's at such a level that any claim to norm-based legitimacy, for instance, they had on Ukraine-Russia war, have been eroded by their stance on the Israel-Palestine war. So, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, as to why, for instance, half of the world is not on the side of Europe or Ukraine, why there were so many countries, most of them middle powers, on the fence, like Brazil, Turkey, etc. Now, this is one of the reasons, right? They feel like they should be on the fence also because there's always, I mean, of course, they have their self-interest at heart too, believe that when it comes to these norm-based argumentation about these wars, that it can go both ways, right? And with Israel and Palestine, I think it's this legitimacy was trying to build on Russia-Ukraine that really took a major blow. And what these things do is that they very much weaken the Western claim to a so-called liberal order, right? And that's what it's doing. And so I do agree with you, and there have been problems with the order. First of all, it was never really very liberal to begin with, and it was never really international because it was very much Western-based and dominated, but it had also certain benefits, right, in certain ways and forms. But what is that whatever has remained of it also is being contested and is, facing a potential collapse because partly of the Western inaction and position that has been taken in these conflicts, mostly in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I don't think that we should take the Israel-Gaza situation in our discussions of the future of the liberal international order. I think this has been an important turning point. And if we see, for instance, the right parties further in Europe, if we see another Republican victory in the United States, these might be the final nails in the coffin, in my opinion, to long run of the collapse of this order. But we don't know what basically future will bring. I don't want to be speculative.
We have again an interruption. Okay, there is an interruption. Okay, no worries. I understand your comment and your answer to my question. Thank you very much. It is a really interesting topic to discuss. We may have much more questions if we were together in a physical, let's say the salon or a hall. But for now, we have to finish our session, and you can watch all these discussions again on our YouTube channel if you're interested. Thanks again for your participation and your presentation, Senem, Aydın, Düzgit, and the other participants, İbrahim Mazlum, Şükrü Bozoğlu, Ebru Uğurlu, Aslı Şirin, Sezgi Durgun, and Radiye Funda Karadeniz. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Zuhal Hocam. Thank you very much for the wonderful questions.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.